Welcome, everyone. This is an exceptional turnout. I'm told next week Barry's buying gourmet coffee and croissants, so be sure to show up. Beer. Beer. Oh. All right. Well, this is a fantastic gathering, and I hope the momentum continues. We'll turn to Katie's grant. Martin.
Awesome. Hello, my name is Zhen, a new PhD student, work with Dr. Katie Martin. And Dr. Katie Martin is an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources. She got her Bachelor of Science in Biology, minor Computer Science from the College of William and Mary. She earned the Master of Science in Ecology from University of Georgia, received her doctorate degree in Environmental and Natural Resource specialization in Forest Science from Ohio State Universities. And then she worked as a postdoc at Penn State and at the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. She is the fellow of Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education at the center of the Integrated Forest Science, USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station. Her research field is the watershed ecology, focuses the investigation of the effects of the changing climate and the land use on water resource, carbon and wildlife, ecosystem resilience and disturbance, and the role of forest management play in sustaining ecosystem services. And now let's welcome Dr. Katie Martin to introduce her work to us.
Thank you for the introduction. So thank you for being here today. About 2 hours ago, my presentation file was corrupted. So I've put it back together, but you're getting a fresh version, so we're going to see how it goes. So today I thought, because I'm a new faculty member and I was hired in a whirlwind of job candidates, not everyone may have my job talk memorized, so I'm going to talk kind of in two parts, sort of an overview of my research and the questions that guide it, and hopefully that will illustrate how I can study forest fire and pig manure, and it makes sense to me. Hopefully by the end it'll make sense to you too. And so I'll also talk at the end about a little more in detail about a recent study. So again, the overview of my research is that I am interested in ecosystem disturbance and resilience. So what happens during change? I like drama, I like fire, I like floods. I want to know what happens when those kind of processes occur. And then looking at other spatial scales, how does land use change, which could be considered in some cases a disturbance, as well as climate change affect ecosystem processes and ecosystem services. And I have been focusing a lot on water in the past few years because it is so critical. And then taking those changes that we see, how can we use forest management as a tool for adaptation or for mitigation? So I was motivated, like a lot of us in the room, probably because I like to be outside. I like to be outside usually by myself or maybe with a dog. So I'm glad to be here speaking in public. But as I was thinking about how I really enjoy being outside, I thought, well, how could I turn that into research, right? Can we be outside and we do research? And so I started out, as an undergraduate, I did research on bird behavior in a lab, and I thought I would rather just go outside. And so, so I started out working in ecology and fire. And so my master's project was the Jones Ecological Research Center in southern Georgia, where I studied the role of fire in wetlands. And so this is pretty basic ecological type questions and how we can turn a wetland, they're seasonally inundated, so even though it doesn't look like there's water here, how we can turn a hardwood-dominated wetland into an herbaceous, biodiverse wetland using fire. And so together with my advisor, we were able to really study thresholds and resilience of different vegetation states. So what maintains a herbaceous wetland and what maintains a hardwood dominated wetland, and where the threshold is for fire to maintain those two different ecosystem states. So pretty basic ecological type of a study in the field. And so for my dissertation research, I had been pretty hot in southern Georgia, so I thought I'd go to the mountains and look at a new question. And so I studied the changes in central Appalachian forests that are experiencing decline of eastern hemlock because of hemlock woolly adelgid. And so kind of the overview of that study was just that hemlock is a very influential species. It sort of determines both the biological and some of the physical aspects of the environment where it occurs. It's thought of as a foundation species. And here we have a tool called structural equation modeling that can determine the strength of different relationships in the environment. And then I also found that the loss of hemlock is somewhat mediated by environmental gradients. So at cooler positions, higher on the slope, the decline was slower, but eventually it was complete. But I had some other concerns. Let's see if this works. Yes. I had some other concerns. I was enjoying being out in the forest. I was a little concerned studying hemlock woolly adelgid. I'd go to these pretty remote parts of the mountains and I'd find dead trees. And this was all, this all began when somebody wanted a Japanese hemlock tree in their yard and they accidentally brought over the hemlock woolly adelgid. So I was thinking about other questions at the same time. So one, of course, is climate change, how the climate is continually warming and getting a little more unpredictable. At the same time, we're having more people in our population either move to the area or just generally growth of the population. So this is a map of urbanization in the southeastern region. The yellow are cities and the red are expected new areas of urbanization by 2060. So you can see that while the climate is changing, also the landscape is changing pretty rapidly. And if you're interested in forests, both of these things are occurring, reducing the amount of forest and affecting the forest that remains. But I also do think about how these changes affect people. And some people may be affected more than others. So this is something called the Social Vulnerability Index to Environmental Hazards. So you can see the red areas are people that are particularly vulnerable to environmental changes. And so when I was thinking about all these things, I thought, I want to incorporate all these different angles in my research as I go forward. And that's really because we want to make sure the planet remains habitable. So human society developed during the Holocene, which had a specific climate. And we really think, we as a community of scientists think that it would be best for human society to remain within that sort of boundary of the climate. And so we can think of planetary boundaries for things like land use change, freshwater use, climate change. This green are the metrics that we think we're doing okay. We're still in a safe area. The yellow is sort of a warning, and then the red, we may have exceeded some boundaries that would keep the planet in a similar state to what we've known as a human society. So these are big questions. So what do you do about that? I was enjoying just using a diameter tape and measuring trees, but I needed a few more tools, I thought, to really capture these aspects that I was interested in. So one are maps. So as a dissertation researcher, I drove across Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia. I slept in a tent with my dog. It was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of driving. So one thing that you can use to substitute for driving is a map. So you can study maps from your computer. And another tool that you can use if you're increasingly concerned about the future and what might happen in the future are simulation models. And so, of course, simulation models are just putting some boundary in what could be possible in the future. It's not going to be a predictive, it's not like going to a fortune teller and knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future. So for the past few years, I've been focused on two tools, 2 simulation models that can give us some idea of what might happen in the future. The first is Landis. This beautiful figure is a courtesy of Dr. Vukomanovic, and this figure is courtesy of me. So obviously, I have some learning to do in my creativity and my data visualization. But Landis is a forest succession and disturbance model that you can use on forested landscapes to look at what might happen in the future. And then Rhesus is another tool that combines a climate model, an ecophysiological model, and a hydrologic model. And that can give you some idea of what might happen in the future to things like streamflow, if landscapes change in a certain way, or even if you manage a forest in a certain way. So a more practical example would be, I used the tool Landis to look at a very important question: do woodpeckers contribute to climate change? I know you've all been thinking that, this may be a major source of climate change. So this is the red-cockaded woodpecker. It's a federally endangered species. It's been on the endangered species list since 1970. The reason that we were curious really about whether it was not necessarily contributing to climate change itself, but these red-cockaded woodpeckers rely on fire-maintained forests. So they have an open understory and sort of older trees that are not necessarily very dense. And so the way that that forest structure is maintained is through regular fire. And so what ecosystem we're talking about here is the longleaf pine ecosystem, which evolved with fire more frequently than pretty much any other forest in North America anyway. So it's usually managed with fire every 3 years. And so one issue when you use fire to manage forests is that we also are increasingly looking to forests to sequester carbon for us and mitigate some of our emissions of carbon dioxide. And so can we use fire, which there's no way of getting around it? Fire emits carbon. It burns the biomass and puts it into the atmosphere. Can we use fire and still sequester carbon in forests? And so what we found when we looked at treatments to manage a landscape, so this was Fort Benning, Georgia, so it's a whole landscape, not just a stand. If we looked at no management of the forest, we had an increase in carbon in the ecosystem over time. So this is a 100-year simulation. If we used prescribed burning every 3 years, so every year about a third of the landscape was burned, we saw that we still added carbon to the ecosystem just at a slower rate. But these woodpeckers are pretty particular, and we're pretty excited to maintain them and increase their population size just as enthusiasts and also as dictated by law under the Endangered Species Act. And so some of the forest was not in ideal condition for red-cockaded woodpeckers. So what if we actually thin the forest as well as burn it so that we're creating more red-cockaded woodpecker habitat? And so we see here that those treatments did continue to accumulate carbon, although at a lower rate. But the short answer is woodpeckers are not contributing to climate change. There's still a positive carbon balance in the ecosystem. Using the tool Rhesus, we can focus, rather than carbon, we can focus on carbon, but this tool allows us to focus on water as well. And so when we look at landscape change, this is a study of the Reedy Creek Reservoir. So this is drinking water for Greensboro. This is what it looks like now. This is the Piedmont Triad International Airport. So everything in red here is urbanized, the green is forest, and the yellow is agriculture. So if we look at it now, it's about half forested, but we project if development patterns of today continue into the future, that'll be just over a third forested in the future. So this is Greensboro growing, the triad growing. And we wanted to see, what if there is a large drought? We're experiencing drought increasingly frequently in the southeast, and that's a big concern because most of our preparation is for flooding. So what happens if there's a drought? Can we use forest management? So this is a study, this is the Forest Now baseline. If we have a drought, so this is an extreme drought where there's no rain for 3 months in the summer. So you can see streamflow decreases as we'd expect. But the gold bars are during the drought if we manage the forest. So if we reduce the forest density by about 20%, we get a little bit of an increase in streamflow, even during this very severe drought. In the future, there's higher streamflow because we have more impervious surface, there are less trees using water, and we still have a small effect if we thin even this reduced amount of forest. So these are just some ideas of strategies we could employ. Obviously, it's difficult to time your forest management to the exact timing of a drought, but these are tools that we look at for options for the future. So really the central themes of my research, as I mentioned in the beginning, are ecosystem disturbance and resilience. That really started with my graduate work. Then land use, climate change, and ecosystem services, particularly water. And so we saw in the last study, we can look at the simultaneous effects of land use and climate change. And then forest management for adaptation and mitigation. So how can we use these tools to ensure quality of life in the future? Highlighted them. And so now, what are the new studies that I'm working on? Well, I have a study in collaboration with the Forest Service. As you may have heard in the headlines last fall, we had some high severity wildfires out in the western part of the state. And so I have Thomas here, who's here in the room. This is some of his master's research. He spent the summer out measuring how the forest responded to these high severity fires. So we're looking at the plants, the understory plants, the trees, and also the response of the stream in this study together with the Forest Service. And the wildlife response as well. We have a project in collaboration with Chris Moorman here, some of you may know him, and a Forest Service researcher to see how birds responded to these severe wildfires. So that again goes back to some of the central themes. But I'm going to talk specifically more today about a current project that I have on pigs and chickens. And the reason that I'm studying this is that I think we need to know a little bit more about some of our decisions for land use and how they might affect us at a landscape or a watershed scale. This is a project that I'm working on with Dr. Ryan Emanuel, and it just came about because of a casual conversation. But in North Carolina, we have one of the highest concentrations of concentrated animal feeding operations in the country. So what is a concentrated animal feeding operation? The EPA has a very specific definition. So it's a place where animals are kept for over 45 days a year. There are no crops or vegetation, and there's 1,000 animal units. So an animal unit is based on beef cattle. So if you have 1,000 beef cattle, you have 1,000 animal units. But obviously other livestock are smaller. So you need 2,500 swine to get 1,000 animal units, 125,000 broiler chickens, so chickens that we eat, or 82,000 laying hens, so where we get a lot of our eggs from. Now we know that these CAFOs are a source of environmental risk. However you feel about their ability to provide food to a growing population, there are some trade-offs. There are known sources of air pollution and potential sources of water pollution. Oftentimes when they do cause pollution in the environment, it's in the form of nutrients, bacteria, and pharmaceuticals. Usually the people affected by these impacts are rural people. They're frequently minorities and people of low income. So the reason that there's a specific definition of a CAFO is that they're federally regulated by the EPA, so long as they meet those definitions and use a liquid waste disposal system. So that means they spray out the manure in the barns. Otherwise, there are no federal regulations of these types of operations. So this is what a liquid waste disposal farm would look like. This is an image from Google Earth. And so this is a waste lagoon behind the barns. This is what most poultry operations use, a dry litter disposal system. So they don't spray out the barns, they muck them out, and they spread the chicken litter on fields. And so they don't have the same waste lagoons. And the reason that we're interested, well, one of the reasons is that CAFOs are a significant land use in North Carolina. So this is the change, the estimated change at a county level in nutrients. This is from, okay, it's from the beginning of the 20th century to 2014. And so you can see the red bullseyes in North Carolina. This means that there's been a lot of change, a lot of addition of nitrogen and phosphorus in the form of animal manure. But these estimates are on a county level. So one challenge is to know where these CAFOs are. They may be a reality of how we're going to produce our meat, but we need to know where they are and think about the best management practices that we can use to reduce their impacts as much as possible. So this is where the permitted operations are. So these are farms that have a water quality permit from the EPA. It's regulated at the state level. And this is point data, so it isn't relative to the size of the farms. It's available from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And that's unique in our state that it's publicly available and it's pretty easy to access. I couldn't find this data from any of our surrounding states. So overall, there's about 2,679, or exactly 2,679 CAFOs in North Carolina as of 2014. We actually have a moratorium on additional liquid waste disposal farms because of flooding from hurricanes. So these are our I'm referring to these as non-permitted because they don't require a water quality permit. These are our primarily poultry operations in North Carolina. This data is not publicly available. There are no data sets because they aren't regulated, so there wasn't necessarily a big motivation to have a publicly available data set. But the Riverkeeper and Waterkeeper alliances took Google Earth imagery, like I showed you before, and then they ground truthed it and GPS the non-permitted operations. So overall in North Carolina, we have 3,967 of these non-permitted farms. And there is not a moratorium on these. So there is some evidence in the literature that non-permitted operations have been increasing because of the moratorium on additional permitted operations. So that's 6,646 farms total. So these are farms with over 1,000 animal units. And these are the black dots to see where they're spread throughout the state. So they're not spread evenly, obviously. So most of them are in the southeastern part of the state. So these two watersheds. So these two watersheds, the Black and the Northeast Cape Fear, which are both sub-watersheds of the Cape Fear River, have the most CAFOs in our state. They actually have the most CAFOs in the country. So they're not distributed evenly. You can see the western part of the state, particularly, there are not a lot. Most of the non-permitted operations are kind of spread between the Piedmont and the coastal plain, and then most of the permitted operations are in the coastal plain. So where are they? So one tool that we have when we look at landscapes is the National Land Cover Dataset. So it's a publicly available data set of land cover. So it's 16 land cover classifications. So this is each pixel, that's 30 by 30 meters, is classified using remote sensing imagery into one of those classifications. So Ryan asked me at one point, how are CAFOs classified in the NLCD? And I said, I don't know. Let's look at it. And it varies. So these farms that have over 1,000 animals are usually classified as cultivated crops. So remember that the definition of a CAFO means that there's no vegetation throughout the growing season. But they're coming up as cultivated crops or hay pasture most commonly. But they're also coming up as natural ecosystems some of the time. So that can be problematic when you're using this data set to estimate landscape level aspects of nutrient cycling or anything like that. Water quality, expected water quality from the landscape. They're coming up as natural ecosystems. And sometimes they're coming up as aquatic ecosystems. So sometimes they're coming up as wetlands. And a waste lagoon is not a wetland. Whether or not you like one better than the other, they're not the same. And so we think this is pretty problematic. I think this is a pretty big oversight in our knowledge of what's happening on landscape scales. So these farms are, many of them are permitted, the ones that require a permit. The others are not permitted. The permitted ones are inspected, but they're inspected at the farm level. So what is happening in this part of the state because of the concentration, we don't really know. And we think that's a pretty important question to investigate. Especially because that region, as you may know, is subject to a lot of tropical cyclone events. So this was in Hurricane Matthew. Actually, compared to previous hurricanes, a lot of the farms were not flooded nearly as badly. There were less lagoon breaches. That doesn't mean that there weren't any, but there were some. So this was last year. And we know that tropical cyclone intensity is increasing. And we know since 1990, Eastern North Carolina has had a direct hit from 15 tropical cyclones, and then 20 have affected the region as well. So given these disturbances and the lack of knowledge that we have about them, we think we don't have the answers yet. That's an exciting part. We know that there's a problem, and we have some suggestions for the future. One would be to increase remote sensing of the location of CAFOs. We don't really know much about even their size because we have some selected point data. We don't have polygons that would suggest how much of the landscape they're actually covering. And then we also suggest, we don't know a lot about the ecological footprint of these farms, which that would be helpful in determining which management practices were most effective at mitigating the impacts. So that would require field data. So who doesn't want to go out and measure the impact of CAFOs on the landscape? And you can see that they're not terribly difficult to identify from imagery. But the actual footprint, we don't know. And whether or not we would include the spray fields, which are not included in the definition of a CAFO, is an important question that we think would need to be answered. So there's some fresh research for you if you had my previous talks memorized, which I'm sure many of you do. So overall, the guiding questions of my research are, given the rapid biophysical and socioeconomic changes that we're experiencing, how are ecosystems going to respond? So that's my most basic ecological type question. And what does that say about their resilience? How can they recover from change? But then moving towards a more applied aspect, what does this mean for ecosystem services, especially water? So how does what happened in natural systems affect us as a human society? And then if that's something that we're not looking forward to, if those changes seem to be negative, what can we do about it? So how can we use forest management or landscape management for adaptation and mitigation of changes that we think are negative? So I think I started out really in natural systems because I like to go hiking, but I got increasingly concerned about the ability to do that and how our world was changing. So I've been increasingly incorporating more anthropogenic landscapes and interdisciplinary problems because I feel like I can contribute ecological perspectives to a lot of these problems, but that's not going to solve them. So we have to partner with other people from other fields and come up with new ideas. So, all right, that's an overview.
So if you got questions
That's right. Yes, sir. I don't know, do you have some money for a specific thing? It's flexible. I'm an ecologist at the core. But I'd say I'm increasingly an interdisciplinary ecologist. Yes, sir. On global climate? Well, so Western fires are a little bit different. So the fires I talked about now are prescribed. I did mention briefly that this is at Fort Benning, but Fort Benning is going to be on fire one way or another because they blow stuff up. So they manage it so that the unexpected fires are smaller. That happens in the West as well. So I also have a study I didn't talk about today at Camp Navajo in Arizona, where there's ponderosa pine. So in Canada, actually, wildfires are a big part of their carbon footprint because there's so much forest and so few people. And fires can turn forests into carbon sources for several years after the fire. In the West, where there's also starting to be in some places, especially in the more arid parts of the West, a transition from a large wildfire to not a forest because the fires are so severe and then the conditions afterwards are pretty dry. And so it's no longer a forest after some of those larger fires. So that's problematic. The scale of the management challenge, and some people in the room may know more than I do about this, but the scale of the management challenge in the Western forest is large. The amount of land that would need to be restored because of the periods of fire suppression during the 20th century to a more fire resilient state, it's a large spatial scale. And it's also, there are a lot of social science aspects because there are groups that are opposed to any kind of management of forests. So it's a big challenge. It contributes carbon to the atmosphere, but I think that's part of one of the challenges of that situation. Yes, sir. Actually, Marcelo is going to teach an entire class next semester. That's a challenge. So, traditionally, resilience is the ability to recover from a disturbance. And there's some debate about ecological resilience and engineering resilience. And measuring it, I guess you could see that one way would be the time to the pre-disturbance state. Another way might be measuring the ecological processes and what rates they are and following disturbance. So like growth rates recovering from drought, things like that. But that's an ongoing, very active field of research. Yeah. Yes.
What are some of the challenges? Students are very trying all the different fields together, but what challenges do you see when you get turned into that field? Or is it all?
It's like sunshine and rainbows. There's no problems. And that's my story. No, I mean it's slower when you have to learn new communications, like new languages that other fields use, when you have to work out with people. People have their expertise and then they have their personality, and so you have to figure out how best to work together. I think it's the best way forward to solving big problems, but I don't think there's anything wrong with learning a field and then seeing how you could transition to interdisciplinary work. That's what's worked for me. It's not necessarily the right path for everyone. But for students, I would say it's easy, for me, it's easy to feel rushed. There's a lot of problems. But hopefully you have time. So just pick a small one that you can start with. Yes, sir. I've been waiting.
So when you touched on some earlier modeling studies, what kind of procedures do you go through?
Well, it depends. So usually, with the rhesus model, which usually what we're interested in right now is water, so Streamflow. And so we see how well it does constructing historic streamflow. So we always try to start with a stream that has a long-term record from usually a USGS stream gauge. And so once we see that it is doing a pretty good job with that historical record, we have more confidence than we would otherwise that the future would be reasonable. I mean, one challenge is that you're assuming that the controlling processes of the future are going to be similar to the past. And we know that there's some question about that. So usually... So with Fort Benning, we had some field data, so we could see if we backcast the model and grew the trees to the point where we had data, if they did a good job. We also used, a lot of times you use flex tower data to see about the exchanges. There isn't a flex tower at Fort Benning, but there was one in a similar forest. So we kind of used that climate record to see if it could match that flex tower record. You use as much data as you can, I would say. Particularly for the variables that you're questioning, you want to make sure that things are accurate. Yes, Josh?
That original Dept threat graph that only 2 years ago said that freshwater was a problem. Why are you fixing it?
I like to be ahead of the curve. Globally, it may not be a problem now. I mean, one thing you can talk about with those kind of planetary boundaries is that some of them, like climate change, are probably more truly global, and freshwater has a global component, but it really affects smaller scale. You know, if you run out of water in your water source, it doesn't really matter if it's raining more somewhere else. So I do have a figure from the Triangle Council of Governments, so that's our local water supply system for Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, Cary. And right now, the demand for water is expected to exceed supply in 2030, which is pretty soon. And a lot of that is demand. So there are some strategies we could use, like building additional water treatment plants. So that is one limiting factor now. But the forecast suggests that supply will remain flat. And we know from the climate perspective that we don't expect that to be true. There is some suggestion that the southeast, some of Guy's work suggests the southeast is getting drier. And also there's pretty good consensus about is that it's more variable. So we may have really dry periods and really wet periods. So even if that graph said it's fine, it's not. You're welcome. Yes, Marcella?
So the cake was, why are cake was concentrated
There's probably a number of factors. Zoning is favorable in those areas. That's a big reason. There are probably other reasons. I'm not sure. But from a tropical cyclone perspective, those are not the best places. It is a rural area with farming. So farming transitioned about the mid 20th century from family farms, and it started with chickens. You guys, I know all this now. This is great. It started with chickens, and then it moved to hogs, having the concentrated systems. And North Carolina just went hog wild. So we're up there with Iowa now. Yeah. Yes. Right. So it would be hard to have one total footprint. You could have a eutrophication footprint, or you could have a. I mean, carbon is usually easily scaled, and then it goes to the atmosphere. But yeah, in terms of, I think you'd need a number of different metrics. But that's something that we're hopefully thinking through next. Yes. Right. Right. So I actually am also part of a team with Ryan, Elizabeth, and some collaborators at Chapel Hill. Theo is a lead in this study where we're looking at the effects of Hurricane Matthew on surface ground, surface water, well water, and I believe deeper ground, surface water, and 2 pools of the groundwater. But I'm not prepared to tell you the answers for that yet. But we are looking at that. And part of the motivation, that's in the Lumber River Basin, which is kind of, well, the Lumber River Basin would kind of be sort of in this area. So we're looking at that. But it could be a problem beyond just when the hurricanes happen.